No one could imagine at the time. But playing out in the background is the single most important moment in NASCAR's history, the culmination of 40-plus years of organized stock car racing, and the apex of their history almost 20 years later. As this black and gold number 97 rounds these final corners, warmed by the ever-bright South Florida sun, the sport of American stock car racing has reached its climax.
Unbelievable deal.
Our story begins on January 17th, 1920. The United States of America has outlawed the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages. The eradication of alcohol-fueled violence and debauchery has fueled the dreams of the Anti-Saloon League and Women's Christians Temperance Union, and their efforts were rewarded with radical government action. There was only one problem with their admirable dream. The unfortunate reality was that by banning the legal sale of alcohol, the United States had inadvertently created one of the largest markets for illegal goods in history. Crime rings sprung up in every major metropolitan market. Speakeasies, a form of underground bar, became cultural icons, and the scarcity of alcohol fueled its popularity to never-before-seen heights. The lower Mid-Atlantic and Upper South had, up until this point in American history, never been a place of economic success. The hill people typically consisted of poor Scottish and Irish settlers, and their way of life had never fully integrated with the agricultural success of their more southerly neighbors, nor the manufacturing success of their more northerly ones. These people were running on razor-thin margins, and once the American Depression began in 1929, most workers in these areas began to struggle just to feed their families. Desperate to find a way to uphold their family's health, many began to turn to a growing business in the Appalachian region that sparked new life back in 1920. The nature of living in deep wooded mountains meant that hauling your corn crop from the fields to the markets was difficult and fraught with potential pitfalls. One simple solution was to distill that corn into an alcohol and sell that instead. Now, this corn grain alcohol was easier to store, easier to transport, and thus easier to sell. And the Scot-Irish settlers had brought with them a knowledge of alcohol distillation to the Americas, and they had been using it for decades. Additionally, and more crucially, they also brought with them a deep-seated dislike of governmental taxation. And once the Prohibition era kicked into gear, the practice of bootlegging to avoid taxation flourished with a new purpose. These bootleggers, who had cut their teeth avoiding the quote-unquote revenuers in an attempt to dodge taxation of their alcohol, were now the hottest commodities in town. They were the only ones who were able to deliver a steady stream of alcohol to the major markets, such as Atlanta, Charlotte, Greensboro, and cities all across the South. These men were not the criminal outlaws they've become so closely associated with in cultural stigmas. Rather, these men were simply family men on a mission to keep those families fed. And as the Depression era started, more and more men in this region found themselves making a living, growing, transporting, and selling this illegal good. Flash forward 15 to 20 years, and the practice is still alive, despite Prohibition itself being recalled in 1933. Many of the regions where bootlegging was once so popular were also the regions that continued to restrict alcohol sales well into the 1960s. Just like any other business, new tactics for more profitable, sustainable, and quicker business sprung to life. And chief among these was employing local mechanics to tune up those delivery vehicles to reach their destination quicker and avoid potentially career-altering encounters with the law. From there, the story is well understood. These competing businessmen took to the unused cornfields and raced each other. Some man with the last name of France sought to organize the unofficial exhibitions and make a legal way for these pilots and mechanics to make a living. Many of these men jumped at the opportunity to finally escape the illegal nature of bootlegging. Those same families who had supported their fathers, brothers, and husbands' efforts to make a living running Shine were now packing the stands, cheering on their sons, cousins, and friends as they attempted to make an honest living, driving race cars. NASCAR was the everyman sport, and a way out of poverty for many, and the single choice of entertainment for so many of the small towns where moonshining was once so popular. Some of those former Shine runners and their friends bought land and built racetracks in order to find a living off the sport of American stock car racing, just as those drivers and mechanics had. Tracks named after their towns, such as North Wilkesboro, Martinsville, and Darlington, quickly became staples of this quirky mid-Atlantic southern sport, bringing with them economic prosperity, jobs, and joy. It's now 2004, and NASCAR has exploded onto the American pop cultural radar through the late 80s and early 90s. An empire growing at such fever pitch that many predict it has the potential to overtake the NFL as America's favorite spectator sport. A train steaming ahead at a pace thought impossible to slow. In the glass towers across from the Daytona International Speedway, the next evolution of stock car racing is being dreamed up. For the 2004 season, the sport has new leadership in the form of Brian France, grandson of founder Bill France, and the executive group placed around him has one goal: take NASCAR's potential and grow it into America's favorite pastime. So far, this new NASCAR has weathered challenges, such as longtime and devout partner Winston being banned by the US government from advertising, to getting new TV contracts signed to record amounts. So far, this group has continued the legacy of phenomenal foresight and decision-making that has led NASCAR to the success it sees today. Unfortunately for them, and for the sport, all of that good luck is about to come to an end. If any of you nerds out there have studied business, one of the first things they'll teach you in micro or macroeconomics is the principle of benchmarking. It's bred in sound logic. Take what you were doing and compare it to your closest business counterparts. What do you do well? What do they do well? What do you do poorly? What do they do poorly? Strengths, weaknesses, pros, and cons. We all do this in our day-to-day life when comparing products and services to purchase. So it's only natural for one to apply it to the world of sports. So that's exactly what the brass in those ivory towers began to do. Compare. What did the rest of the sports world do that we didn't? And where did we struggle against them? Well, it was obvious. The answer was playoffs. Every sport crescendoed its season with soaring viewership and a championship battle that would create storylines aplenty. While NASCAR, on the other hand, would start its season with its biggest race, the Daytona 500, and slowly but surely peter out over the course of its grueling 36-race calendar. NASCAR's system was unique, but they hoped by creating a playoff system that could capture new interest in the later half of the season while maintaining its dominance in the wake of the 500 every February. A sound plan, rooted in logic, approved by many in suits. However, come time to announce this new plan, sentiment took a distressing turn. Another business concept they'll teach you in school is the concept of empathy-based marketing. Its core principle is to place yourself in the shoes, hearts, and minds of your customers in order to understand what they do and don't like. This enables you to, typically anyway, make excellent choices that get received very well by your clientele. One very jarring reminder of the importance of empathetic-based decision-making is the tragedy of New Coke, documented extremely well by YouTuber Emperor Lemon. Linked below, the story can be summarized quite succinctly. Coca-Cola was losing its position as America's go-to soft drink in the wake of Pepsi's successes, turning its soda into the soda for a new generation. With marketing targeted at Gen X and utilizing famous spokespeople of the time, Pepsi had Coca-Cola shaking in their boots. One of the more successful campaigns Pepsi had was the dubious Pepsi Challenge, where random people were brand blinded and asked which soda they preferred, A or B. Blindfolds removed, and most of them had shown a preference for the taste of Pepsi. Now, these experiments were wrought with flawed execution, but the outcome was nonetheless felt. So in an effort to compare, and an effort to benchmark, Coca-Cola decided that it was high time they ditched their inferior product in favor of one that customers preferred. Replicating Pepsi's experiment, Coca-Cola formulated a new recipe that successfully beat Pepsi in their own Pepsi Challenge, and thus obviously would help Coca-Cola regain its dominance and usher in a new era of revenue growth and category leadership.
What's the matter, Wilbur?
They changed my Coke.
Something wrong with it?
I know, but they sure changed.
Unfortunately, by skipping on empathetic-based decision-making, Coca-Cola had failed to realize the importance the original flavor had to their audience. They failed to understand how the subtle keynotes of its flavors triggered rushes of nostalgia, comfort, marketing, happy memories, and more. Once removed, fans no longer cared for the product. Coca-Cola would never forget the lessons learned from New Coke, and now in 2024, still remain as dominant as ever. Oh right, I'm telling a story about NASCAR. Anyhow, where were we? February 2004, and NASCAR is embarking on the first season with a playoff format. The fan favorite, Dale Earnhardt Jr., son of blue-collar American folk hero Dale Earnhardt, would go on to win the season-opening Daytona 500 for the very first time in his career. The season seemed poised for success. Drivers such as Matt Kenseth, Jimmy Johnson, Jeff Gordon, and Tony Stewart established themselves early with Earnhardt Jr. as championship favorites. Welcome to the hills of eastern Tennessee. It was in these very mountains that the weary Scot-Irish settlers found solace all those years ago. The rolling hills, slippery streams, and the secluded setting of this land reminded those settlers of home, and thus they called it their new one. Without this setting, NASCAR wouldn't exist, and through that beauty came this, Bristol Motor Speedway, NASCAR's crown short track. A half-mile concrete Thunderdome, it has played host to some of the sport's largest moments, and certainly contains its most passionate fans. If one thing is for certain, the fans that descend upon this speedway are the very heartbeat of NASCAR. Today, a brash juvenile by the name of Kurt Busch is about to win the first race of his career. Typically, this is a moment that almost all drivers will receive cheers, and a general state of merriment will follow the NASCAR fandom. However, today, that won't be the case. Today, a villain will be born.
Typically gets every week. That ain't my job. I am there! I'm there! Holy Bobby, let's down! I'm so pissed off right now I can't see straight. Ooh, screwed over the meltdown on the radio. Ooh, look like a monkey in a touchdown!
Refrains me from not beating the out of you right now if you ask me stupid questions.
Black cloud above my head. That thing.
Kurt, a native of Sin City, Las Vegas, Nevada, has been on a meteoric rise to the top of stock car racing since his dad put him in a race car for the first time. Kurt's mission, it's simple. Be the best and let no one stand in your way. A trait his father shared with him and his younger brother Kyle will go on to emulate. Oh, who's that in the red and white Dodge, you ask? Well, that's just Mr. Excitement, Jimmy Spencer, a downtrodden journeyman driver with only 2 career wins to his name back in 1994. He's having a minor career resurgence here in 2002 with backing from retail giant Target. Jimmy has begun to embody the soul of NASCAR fans, a hard-working, passionate, no-luck-having man from rural Pennsylvania. Kurt, however, he's been raised a killer. Let no one stand in your way, whatever it takes. The ends justify the means, and well, the rest, as they say, is history.
Whoa, he hit him. Busch got under him and muscled Jimmy Spencer. You don't see that often.
This moment set off one of the ugliest rivalries in NASCAR history. These two would go at it week after week, culminating with Kurt and Jimmy beefing at Michigan, resulting in Kurt coming away with a busted nose. NASCAR acted quickly to suspend Jimmy before his best track, the aforementioned Bristol, and the fans rallied in droves to support Spencer. Shirts, signs, chants, all were on the table. And there was no question that summer evening, NASCAR Nation had had enough of this punk.
Envelope you and circumference you and let you know how they feel, that's for sure. That's what Bristol's all about. And the group here, you know, there's a bunch of them that are screaming.
On the surface, Kurt should have been yet another young star for fans to latch onto. I mean, he's doing exactly what a young Dale Earnhardt did, but there's just something about him that rubs fans the wrong way. Maybe it's his hometown. Sin City, after all, isn't the kind of place NASCAR has its roots in. Maybe it's his physical appearance, looking like that insolent kid from back in high school. Maybe it's his car owner. But I think there's something deeper at play. I think the reason the NASCAR fan base doesn't like Kurt, it's not really even about Kurt himself. Kurt Busch is the scapegoat for the larger face of American stock car racing's demise. Back to 2004, and we're about to witness the very first race in NASCAR's new playoff era. The inaugural chase is underway. Oh right, you probably don't know, I guess because you clicked on this video, you probably do. I'll keep this short. NASCAR's new playoff system will be dubbed the Chase, and would feature a complete points reset after the 26th race of the season, enabling a better points narrative late in the season and hopefully doing for NASCAR what the playoffs do for other sports. After all, that's the whole point of benchmarking, as we discussed earlier. Best practices in the lot. Kurt Busch will go on to win this race and start his run for a crown. Up until this point, I've tried to avoid statistics. As a narrative element, I think they're just outright boring. However, in order to give context to the culmination of the 2004 season, we need to dive in. There are 3 statistics we can use to overall determine the best driver of a season. The first of which is going to be wins, top 5s, top 10s. Second being laps led, and third being average finishing position. Now, typically, the season champion would be at least the best in one of these 3 stats, if not all 3. In 2004, Jimmie Johnson had the most wins with 8, most top 5s, and led the most laps at 1,312. Jeff Gordon came a close second in laps led at 1,237, led the series with 25 top 10s, and had the best average finish of 11.4. All of this with a respectable 5 wins. Fan favorite Dale Earnhardt Jr. had the season's second highest win total with 6, and led the 3rd most laps. All of this while tying Jimmie Johnson for second in average finish. These drivers in any other season would have battled each other to the bitter end to become a champion. No one else even came close. So why did I bring any of this up? Why does it matter that Kurt Busch didn't even come close to matching the seasons of Dale Jr., Jeff Gordon, and Jimmie Johnson? Well, that goes back to the very origins of the sport, the ethos of the fan base, and the very nature of stock car racing. You see, the point system had begun to represent something. Its dirty, fingernail, long-winded nature led fans to relate their grind as blue-collar, hardworking folks to the NASCAR championship. The long slog of a championship fight represents many fans' life struggle to achieve success in America's lower to middle classes, working day after day, chipping away at their dream. They identify with drivers overcoming adversity and rallying to slowly chip away, week after week, at theirs. There are no handouts in this championship system. You can't overcome poor performances by getting lucky right at season's end to win a championship, or for that matter, by getting a head start. You must efficiently work with your team to be the best and earn your legacy. The American journeymen have been shoved around, disrespected, and straight up devalued. Degree-holding executives had walked into their towns, claimed their superior ways, and annihilated their jobs and dreams. Aspirations of promotions were vetoed by arbitrary limitations they simply could not fulfill while supporting a family. But they still had NASCAR on Sundays, tuning in to watch the 43 most deserved drivers in the world battle at 200 miles an hour, living out their dreams, searching to become a champion. The towns that built NASCAR were being shoved out of the way. In their place, grand cathedrals of speed were built in trendy markets like Las Vegas, Texas, and California. Towns like Wilkesboro, Rockingham, and Darlington, and many, many others were being sacrificed at the altar of expansion. The hardcore fans teared, jeered, wrote angry letters. But what did the numbers tell us? How were we stacking up versus our competition? Year-over-year metrics, they always tell the full story.
It's not going to be enough. Kurt Busch is the 2004 NASCAR Nextel Cup Series champion.
Nearly 20 years later, and NASCAR is a shell of its former self. The fans who wanted to be a part of that quirky sport, they left with time. And once the trendy nature of NASCAR faded, NASCAR management noticed that the backbone of the sport had left without them ever noticing. NASCAR has only doubled down on their choices over the coming decades. Now the champions determine in a singular race, rather than the 10 it used to be. The season's efforts regularly don't reward the best drivers.
You know, look, these championships aren't like winning like Petty and Earnhardt used to win them.
And even when they do, it all just feels hollow. The soul of the sport was sacrificed when we left those small American townsfolk behind. But why? On paper, bringing the sport to 300,000 fans in Texas makes a lot more sense than 50,000 in Wilkes County. To anyone who only looked at the numbers, the logic, the markets, they missed the biggest factor of them all: emotion. What fans tuned in for every week was passion. For the drivers, mechanics, and promoters in these towns, this wasn't just some pastime. This is how they fed their families. When the Allisons and Cale Yarborough fought in the 79 500 in front of millions of snowed-in viewers, it wasn't the fight that made them watch the next race. It was trying to understand why anyone could care so much just to punch another man in the face for just some circle track race. When the fans from Texas showed up to the race, there was something missing. The fans whose very next meal depended on the results of the race, well, they weren't in the stands. They were back in Wilkes County, watching their town rot. The drivers who would give anything just to live their dream, well, they were on their way out too. When we left small-town America, small-town American racetracks died, and so too did their personalities. Drivers like Jimmy Spencer, well, they were replaced by rich kids after Nepo babies, and the fans just couldn't relate to their stories. You see, Gen Pop consumers are not vapid trend followers. They're efficient buyers. They let passionate subgroups determine what is and isn't worth spending your time and money on. The more passionate a subgroup, the more likely a Gen Pop audience is to consume that product. However, as the passion of Earl from Danville, Virginia faded, James of California, he noticed too. And soon enough, they both weren't watching anymore. Kurt Busch's championship represented more than can be put into words. It was the premonition of what was to come. It was a warning sign to management that this direction was going to fail. Kurt winning the championship was the signal to NASCAR loyalists that the sport they once loved was now being run by those who fundamentally didn't understand them. NASCAR leadership had dammed up their Nile source. It built one crazy large reservoir. But eventually, it caught up with them. However, I don't want to end this story on a sour note. I want to offer a glimmer of hope to NASCAR, the fans, and all of those who love stock car racing. Kurt Busch, our story's scapegoated villain, has a redemption arc. So let's pick up our story from 2004. A year removed from his championship, Kurt had run himself out of the number 97 ride through his arrogant behavior and walking train wreck choices. Kurt began one of the worst public-facing, self-destructive journeys in American sports history. Kurt could not have been more disliked, and it would land him out of the sport entirely entering the 2012 season. Against all odds, Kurt chose to race for free to keep his dream alive, becoming a journeyman driver, fighting to take slower teams and building them into successful organizations. Over the coming decade, Kurt would slowly become a fan favorite for this new hard-working dreamer status, and unfortunately, his inevitable retirement from the sport was significantly hastened by a nasty concussion at Pocono in 2022. Kurt now embodies everything that NASCAR fans aspire to love and offers NASCAR itself a path to redemption. In the middle of 2018, NASCAR was forced into new leadership, and post that date, the sport has at least been stable. They've done a better job than the previous cohort of appealing to newer fans while also embodying the ethos of our history and appealing to the loyalists who are still around from the peak. NASCAR returned to North Wilkesboro Speedway in 2023 at the cost of millions. However, I implore all of you to view the return of Wilkesboro and the upcoming returns of Rockingham and Bowman Gray with a different lens than pure metrics. The return of these facilities isn't about viewership or even butts and seats. It's about bringing back the passion that set NASCAR apart from every other sport. As someone who sat in those rustic Wilkesboro seats in May of 2023, I think they did.